Welcome to the Executive Coaching Podcast, where Executive Coach Alicia Cowan will discuss leadership topics and coaching solutions to tackle the most difficult problems that keep you from leading your team to success.
Hey there, leaders. It's Alicia Cowan. Welcome to the Executive Coaching Podcast. Well, as always, I'd like to give you a quick personal update at the start of this podcast to tell you what's going on around the Cowan house. We recently just survived the second hurricane in 2 weeks. Milton just went through Florida this week, and we were very lucky to be relatively unscathed by the storm. I was actually traveling in Los Angeles this week, so I had to watch it from afar as my husband and kids were kind of hunkered down in the house. And so very terrifying to watch from afar. But I was super lucky in the sense that we did have a little bit of damage to the house, but nothing really extreme. We lost power for a little bit, but everything's back on. Everything's back to normal, getting back to normal, and cleanup is underway. And my family was all safe. So I will say, definitely fortunate in that arena. And we know that there's so many people that were impacted in a way more severe way around Florida. So our thoughts and prayers are with them as they hopefully can recover and get back to a semblance of normalcy now that the storm is well out into the Atlantic. But yeah, so that's what's been going on a lot around here. It's just trying to make sure that we were prepped for that. And then secondarily, I do want to also recognize this is the 50th episode of the podcast. And so for me, a big milestone moment to hit 50 and have done this 50 times now. And I will say I was super lucky because this week when I was traveling in LA, I actually ran into a listener. And I will give her a shout out because what was really cool for me was to hear her experience. And she talked about using some of the tools and the tips and tricks and actually taking them into the workplace. And she had a pretty significant conversation with her leader about her own development, what she wanted to do with her career, and talked about all the great things that she is now working on as a result. And I will say that for me was amazing because this is why I like to do this work, is to bring education and bring that knowledge to people and to hopefully inspire them and to make our workplaces better by sparking some thoughts that might turn into some action that help get them better results. So shout out to her and to all of you listeners. We have been did this together now for 50 episodes, and I am so lucky to be able to do this and so thrilled that we hit 50 together. So thank you for that. So now let's dive into it. That's leads me to my next topic and what we want to talk about today. So what I really want to dive into is what it's like to be a woman in the workforce. And why this topic came about for me is I'm actually prepping for a meeting that I'll be presenting at. I'm doing a session with a group for their on-site meeting that's coming up here in October. So I've been doing a lot of research on the topic and thinking a lot about the topic. And so I wanted to share that knowledge and research with you here today. And as usual, hopefully this sparks some thought and can be helpful for you. So I thought this broader audience needed to hear it. So, why does this topic matter? And I'll say this. I think women have made a ton of progress, but let's also be real. As a woman, we can still face some very unique challenges in the workforce. And I will say for whatever generation that you're in, if you're like an emerging coming up leader, less tenured, if you're a seasoned executive and senior leader, like a lot of my listeners are, or if you're just really navigating the landscape of the corporate world and in which you're a minority, this episode is for you. And it can really hit home no matter what group and what generation that you're in. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to break it down. I'm going to talk some facts and some stats about what the landscape actually looks like. And then most importantly, we'll talk about some practical solutions, as I always like to do, some things that are actionable right away that can empower you to start to make change today. So, before we dive into the deep stuff, I want to start off with a couple questions for you to kind of think about this. The first question that I have for you is think about the influences that you've had as leaders within your sphere of influence and thinking about specifically about your immediate family. And think about if you had a grandmother that worked outside of the home for over 10 years. And for me, I did not. I had amazing set of grandparents. Actually, I was lucky enough because I have a lot of step parents. I had lots of grandmothers, but I can't think of one. And again, not all of them were stay-at-home moms, but a lot of them worked outside of the home, but not for longer than 10 years. So think about that. The second question is then to think about your immediate mother and your mother and whether or not she worked outside of the home for over 10 years. And again, I'll say my immediate mother, my birth mother, did not. She did work for part of her time, but did not for long periods of time over 10 years. And then think about yourself. Think about, are you planning on working outside the home for more than 10 years? And for me, it definitely already crossed that threshold with having been in the workforce now for it'll be 25 years this fall. So way more than the 10-year mark. So just think of that snapshot of your like immediate family. And the chances are, again, this is not neither bad nor good. It's just the facts of what is. Not all of us had necessarily that example or that role model in our immediate family who was balancing climbing the corporate ladder and the career life and the family life. And again, that's not okay. That's okay. That's not an indictment on any of those generations because obviously they took great care of us and got us here, right? But I will say this, the reason I even bring it up is because in a lot of ways, we are pioneering and blazing our own trail here. And a lot of us, again, we're not necessarily in situations where we had somebody modeling all of that for us or gave us like the example that we could see immediately in our life, in our family, in our circle to see what that looked like. Again, neither good nor bad, just what it is. And so we're going to talk about what that can actually look like and why this work is so important. But for me, and I'll say this, I think when I was coming up in the workforce, I didn't think about a lot about it. I just, it wasn't in my mindset. It was more so kind of like my immediate work that was in front of me and wasn't really thinking about the landscape. So I think it's important to bring awareness and to talk about. And so that's the thing. It's easy to sometimes feel alone when you're navigating a career path when you don't have a lot of female examples to look to. But you're not alone. It's very easy to assume also that women from different generations are facing a lot of different challenges. But the truth is, we have way more in common than we do differences. And so the conversation today is about creating that awareness, about building community, and about really understanding the collective power that we have as women in the workforce. And I will say this. I'm a big proponent. This is not about bashing men whatsoever. And in fact, I think myself, I had so many men that have been allies to me in my career and that have helped me. So that's not what this is about. It's just more so, again, that bringing that awareness and understanding so that you can be more educated. So let's dive into it. Let's understand. Speaking of the education piece, let's talk facts. Let's talk about the realities of what it looks like on the landscape of today's workforce for women. We can't dive into the good stuff unless we can talk about some cold hard facts so we know what we're working with here. So sheer number of women in the workforce. So I pulled this from the U.S. labor website and talking about some of the numbers. So the group of women in the workforce currently is 57%. So we're majority, but we're still navigating some significant challenges, even though we are majority, like the persistent wage gap and underrepresentation in senior leadership, which I'll get into. So in terms of the number of women in the workforce, we've actually seen a slight decline over the past 2 decades. Definitely the impacts have been economic shifts, the recessions, and of course, COVID-19 definitely was a massive influence on how many women stayed in the workforce. And we're projected to grow. We're projected that, especially within the ages of like 25 to 54, there will be an estimated increase of about 3 million women entering the workforce by 2031. So we're growing. However, I will say again, what we've faced with prior generations in the 60s, for example, less than 40% of the women were in the workforce. And then my generation, I'm Gen X, so that's like the 1965 to 1980 birth date range. They saw a significant growth in participation in the workforce, and they were over 50% in the 80s to early 90s. So as you can see, again, we are definitely a majority, but as we saw in the example that we mentioned before, more than likely, the generations ahead of us, we didn't necessarily have that majority. Okay. So let's talk about earnings. So in 2023, women earned about 82 cents for every dollar that men earned. And Black and Latina women, that gap was even wider. Again, this is on the rise, which is good news. But in the past, it hasn't been so much. So for example, in the 90s, Gen X women, they were at 70 to 75 cents on the dollar compared to men. And then in the baby boomer generation, during the 60s and the 70s, women really were at that 58 to 63 cents on the dollar compared to men. So again, on the rise, but still not where we need to be. And then here's the kicker. So it's not just a pay issue, it's also about representation and access to the different leadership levels. So let's talk about leadership roles. As of today, only about 20% of senior leadership roles are held by women. Again, growing and progressing, but still not enough. And so if you think about workforce participation, it definitely impacts like how many people can rise to leadership levels based on that. Again, Gen X women, my generation, typically are first in their families to pursue careers and higher education in large numbers. However, my generation still faced a lot of glass ceilings in a lot of industries, hence the disparity in those leadership numbers. Again, that's progress because a lot of baby boomer women entered the workforce in really big numbers in the 70s and 80s due to the massive feminist movement during that time. However, their career progression was really hampered by societal norms, and they definitely didn't have all the same legal protections around pay discrimination that exist today. Okay, let's talk about one more factor, being a working parent. Working moms, currently 64% of moms with kids under 3 are in the workforce. Now, again, that's on the rise, that's increasing, that's double what it was in the 70s. However, again, mentioning that COVID factor, the working parents, especially working moms, are really facing very unique barriers. So, cost of childcare can eat up a massive portion of a family's income, and a lot of people opt out being in the workforce because of that massive expense. So those are some of the factors that are impacting, and those are some of the facts of what it looks like to be in the workforce as a woman today. So here's something to think about. We're really a part of a generational wave that's made a huge impact on the workforce. And our moms and grandmothers might not have had the same opportunities, but they've really paved the way. And now we're carrying that torch that they passed us forward. And so I see it as our responsibility to be good stewards of the progress. And we have to keep pushing for change. And not just for ourselves, but all the women that come after us. I have four daughters. So I think about the little ladies that are coming up in the workforce and how to pave the way for them in order to make sure that their experience of the workforce is different and even more significantly improved than the generations that have done the same that have come before me. And so now let's transition. Let's talk about that. What can we do as a woman in the workforce? So the first thing that I want to talk about is just to control what we can. And that's first things first. I think sometimes, even hearing this and researching this, I can be a little frustrated and get a little down. But I have to remember, and I'll give this tip to you as well, is not to let negativity take over and to realize there are challenges, but it is not all doom and gloom. And I think that if we focus on the things that we can influence, we can take back our power and realize that we do have influence. And I think about too, I think the prior generations, they did not have social media access or the internet to like go and research this type of stuff or to see and compare and do the big compare and despair. They just had to like keep going and get after it. And so I think about that and how to make sure I can keep myself focused and keep the frame of reference to like not get distracted with the negativity. Okay, so that's number one. Two, a big proponent, of course, of coaching. So coach yourself or get a coach. And I love to talk about coaching. So whether you're working with a coach like me or you're learning to coach yourself, both are super powerful. And it's important to recognize that there is a part of being a woman in the workforce. Sometimes our primal brain likes to take over and it's trying very desperately to try to keep us safe. So it like may give us warnings about things that might necessarily be reality and trying to harm us. It may just be like fight or flight kicking in. And I think that's a really big part of coaching is the mindset piece of it. And so one tip I have is just if you have that fear or doubt creeping up, again, as a woman in the workforce, you have to ask yourself, is this a real threat or is this a story that I'm telling myself? And as a female, I truly mean like this is about increasing your self-awareness and increasing your objectivity. This is not about gaslighting you and telling you that there is not some real disparity with the workforce, because I just gave you facts that there are. But you have to be able to discern what's reality and what is us spinning like stories about what could be. Okay. And sometimes it's hard to be objective about that type of topic yourself. Sometimes you need some help. That's why I suggest self-coach or get coached about some of the things that you're facing as a woman in the workforce. Number three, the next thing is to talk and think about how you want to show up and show up very intentionally. So I do a lot of work on like teaching somebody how to own and decide what their leadership style is going to be. And there's some great research from Harvard Business Review, and there's an article that talks about developing your leadership style. And what I love about the way they describe it is that there's two different types of leadership markers. There's attractive markers, which are more about being approachable, and there's more powerful markers, which are more about confidence and competence. Now, generally, attractive leans a little bit more with like this feminine energy, and powerful markers sometimes carry like this connotation of a little bit more male energy. And now I'm not saying that it's binary and that you can only have one or the other, but I think as a female, we have to realize what our style looks like. And sometimes we have to decide intentionally how to balance both within the workplace. Okay. And it can be it's a real thing to potentially overuse one or the other. And that's why I think it's really important to experiment with your leadership style. And so how I do this is you think about some of the situations that you might encounter in the workplace, and you get to decide what leadership style do I want to use to interact and engage as a part of that experience. And so when I ask females about what some of their experiences are like, especially when they're working in a male-dominated industry, some of the things they came up with were to, number one, stop apologizing. Again, that can be a little bit more like leaning more attractive of like people pleasing and trying to be really nice. So to stop apologizing. Number two, they talked a lot about how to handle being interrupted or talked over, or how to get their word in, and how to like, that's again, leaning a little bit more powerful, like how to interject appropriately and respectfully. Three, they talked a lot about how to handle being mansplained and how to be appropriate and professional when counteracting that. And number four, a lot of women talked about how to uplift other women's or men's voices if they weren't being heard in the room. So people that might be a little bit more quiet, how to be a good ally to them as well. And so those are just some very real tactical things that I'm going to be working with. Again, in the session that I'm doing that's coming up, I'm going to work with like how to coach women and how to do those things in a way that is appropriate. Not an easy challenge to solve, but I think it's, again, the punchline here is that it's important to use a balance of both, like the attractive and the powerful markers, and figure out what works for you in order to build relationships and trust. So that was number three. Number four, big thing that I found is so important is to build a community. And so one thing I know for sure is that as women in the workforce, you cannot do this alone. Whether it's about mentoring others or connecting with peers and colleagues, you've got to build up a strong community of women, and it's essential. I call it like building up your own board of directors. It's important to, again, you can share stories, you can support each other, you can lift each other up. So I consciously do this. I seek out mentors and I choose to mentor other women. I also, I seek out groups. And when I moved to Tampa, I really had to seek out lots of different resources and groups. And I'm still in the rebuilding process from a really deep community that I had built in Columbus, Ohio. I am still in the process of doing that. But I can't tell you, it's so imperative to build up a community. And I think a lot of times people are afraid to do this because they think that people sometimes will be a little bit more competitive and not understanding. And I tell you, I found the opposite experience. When you find the right groups of women in the right community, you absolutely can find a group that will help lift you up. And lastly, the big one that I have for this is to practice all of these things. So as a woman in the workforce, you've got to put yourself out there and practice some of these skills. And it's not a one and done thing where you can just take some of these things and just do it once and have it nailed. It is about showing up, coaching yourself, creating community consistently. And it's something, again, I coach leaders on all the time. So that's what I have for you today. And I wanted to say, it's your turn now. If you have questions for me, thoughts for me, experiences you want to share, don't hesitate. I love hearing from you. So you can hit me up on LinkedIn, or you can send me your thoughts and comments. You can reach me through my website. I am at aliciacowencoaching.com. It's ELISIAKEOWN coaching.com. And I would love to keep the conversation going. I love hearing from you and how you are using this content. And so that's a wrap. So hopefully you are walking away with some new ideas and insights on how to lead as a woman in the workforce. And if you are an ally to a woman in the workforce, hopefully this is insightful for you as well. So remember, it is not about being perfect. It's about showing up, growing, and creating workplaces where we can all thrive. So thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Executive Coaching Podcast with Alicia Cowen. If you're ready to have an executive coach who's ready to help you lead your team to success, then book an introductory call at aliciacowencoaching.com/call.